Most of us are here, so I'm this guy, Ray Gallen, and you're not. And so what we're going to do today is go through, some of you have seen either webinars or other presentations that I've done about cognitive science and user assistance. And so what I'm going to try and do with you today is probably cover some of the same ground that those talks have covered, but get into how we can actually do it. So we're going to do it hands-on. We're going to have a lot of interaction, and we're going to start right away with this. So we're just going to have a look at a little video here, and then there will be a quiz. And by the way, everybody be aware there will be cat videos. So let's have a look at this. So, okay, we've seen the video. Now, the question is, how many living beings are in that video? Anyone? Two? Which two?
Well, you can see the human's thumb, you can see the toad.
And you can see the
toad.
oh, right, the toad. Okay. Anyone else?
I'd say there's one.
One?
Yeah.
Which one?
The frog.
The frog is the only living being?
And the other was just a thumb.
The other was just a thumb. Okay. Anyone else? Any other ideas? Yes?
Could you include bacteria in that? It's phenomenal.
Pardon?
Could you include bacteria and other living organisms?
There are bacteria and other, so there could be millions and billions of them. Yeah? Okay. Anyone else? Any other ideas? Pardon?
You count the things, the bugs that are crawling down the...
Count the... Anything else? What's the definition of a living being? Yes.
What's your definition of video?
What's the definition of video?
Because there's a video within a video, and the video within a video has got lots more things.
Yes. Okay, so we have a video inside of a video, and so the question is, what's the definition of a video? I'm going to make a proposition to you, which goes along with that question, which is that there are 0 living beings in this video, because it's a video. It is, in fact, a representation coded in zeros and ones of things, people, frogs, and so on, and the frog is looking at a coded version of ants crawling around on a screen. So we're looking at several meta levels, in fact, of reality here. What's interesting is that from a cognitive point of view, we assimilate the image of the living beings as being living beings. That is, that from a cognitive point of view, we do the suspension of disbelief. We no longer think about the fact that it's a digital representation. We just accept it as almost, is it live or is it Memorex? We don't care anymore. And I make the observation, this is an observation I've made several times, my 21-year-old daughter loves to stay in constant contact with all her little friendlets, and she does it quite seamlessly, going between face-to-face and digital on her mobile. And she does this without even thinking about it. And she does not see a qualitative difference between being in touch digitally and being in touch face-to-face. She just accepts the transition as being something that she does, something that's part of her life. Her next oldest sibling, who is 4 years older than she is, does not do this. So what we're seeing is a generational difference of 4 years in terms of how we accept certain things cognitively. So what we can say is, all reality is perception, or as some other people say, perception is reality. And that's very, very important for us as people who are designing essentially learning tools, because user assistance is a learning tool. We don't think of it as training, we don't think of it as teaching, but in fact, it is a learning tool. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is about learning theories and about how we acquire information. So some of what we're going to touch on as we go through, these are just some of the notions. You won't see any, you'll see very few headings that actually repeat these, but these are the questions that we're going to be approaching as we go through the day, and we'll take a pause midway through so that people can be human and do what humans need to do. And we're going to end up with this notion of finding help and making it count through connectivism. And by help, I mean the stuff we write, the stuff we produce. So, let's start off right away with something. This is, Spanish surnames are done differently than how they're done here and in most of the Western world. So you have a situation here where you have Eduardo Garcia Jimenez, who marries Ana Montoro Alvarez, and they have kids. So they have a girl whose name is Alicia Garcia Montoro. They have a boy who is Julio Garcia Montoro. These kids grow up and they get married. So Alicia marries Manuel Lopez Gil, and Julio marries Nuria Sanchez Camacho. They have kids. So Manuel and Alicia have a kid, a girl named Marta. Anybody care to venture what her last name would be? Marta's? Lopez Garcia, is correct. And Julio marries Nuria, and they have a son named Carlos, who would be Garcia Sanchez, exactly. Okay, how many of you already knew this? Okay, not that many. So most of you, in fact, deduced. That is, you can figure it out yourself. Now, one of the things that we need to do as people who create online help, user assistance, user guidance, is we need to give our users the kind of information that will, most of the time, allow them to figure it out themselves. Right? Good help is help that gets used once and never again. Right? Because what do we want to do? We want to make it comfortable for our users. We want to make our users happy using our products. Right? So, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is how we do that. How we help people deduce what it is that they need to do. So I'm going to start with the notions that come from Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology I'm not going to go into great detail on these things. First of all, some of you probably know some of this, and also we're not here to do psychological studies, but to know something about how people learn. So, Gestalt tries to understand how we acquire and maintain stable precepts in a noisy world. I like that. Stable precepts in a noisy world. And the notion is that we are, differently from the computers that we use, analog, and we tend to be holistic. We are massively parallel, something that we're still trying to develop in the computing world. And we are self-organizing in terms of our brains. And so we tend to, with the eye, we tend to grab everything all at once. Our field of vision, which is a little bit larger than 180 degrees, I think most of us have something like 270 degrees of field of view, peripheral vision. We get all of that as a matrix that we seize in one go. Then we start looking at details. But first we just look at the full field, right? Think about, say, when you go to a museum and you look at a painting. First thing you look at is, poof, there it is in the frame, right? And then you start to look at how is it done, what's the imagery, what are the brush strokes like. Depending on how interested you are in painting, you might get quite detailed about it. But the first look is just the field as a whole. So we look at something and we see what? A face, right? Then we realize, oh, that's not a face, that's a sink, right? And so the idea in Gestalt is not the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, it's that the whole is other than the sum of its parts. We make something different out of it, just by our capacity to interpret and parallel process stuff. So here's another aspect, which is reification. Reification is a fancy word for saying we fill in the gaps. So we see here, this pointer doesn't seem to like, oh, there it is, or over here. All right, never mind. Here, we see a triangle. And, but there is no triangle. We didn't draw it, huh? Here and here, we have forms. Now, this one is interesting to me. I don't know about you, but in my perception, I see two possibilities. I see a kind of like an S there, but I also see a rectangle. So it's both kinds of perception. So we have the, you have this vibration between two different kinds of perception of foreground, of figure and ground. Here we see a snake, or at least I do. And then in this one, we have actually a three-dimensional figure that's created by absence, in fact, right? By something missing. So what we do is our brains, with their parallel processing capacity, our brains fill in all kinds of missing information and we just fill in those gaps, right? Now, John Carroll, who's the granddaddy of minimalism, he calls that inferential learning. And he actually says that we learn better inferentially than if we, give the user all the information. So the notion is that we tell people enough that they can deduce, and so we have to give them enough, because otherwise they won't get it, but we don't give them everything. I used to work for the French division of a very large company that has a meatball for a logo. We used to have arguments between the French technical writers and the American ones, because the French wanted to do this. And the Americans said, almost they wanted, insert the screwdriver in the slot, turn the screwdriver counterclockwise until the screw comes out. It wasn't quite that bad, but almost. Right? And by the way, screw as a verb was forbidden. The point being that John Carroll, who is himself an American, says you don't need to tell people to put the screwdriver in the slot. You just need to tell them to take out the screw, and they can figure out how to do the rest. And they'll learn it better. It's also, from a perceptual point of view, once we've acquired these holistic notions, it can get very difficult to stop seeing faces everywhere. So this is something that we learn by habit as well as other things. So let's do a little exercise here. This is from a real website. And so is this. And now what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to pair up, so work in twos, in which one person takes on the role of a green top owner, and the second person is a prospective owner and is going to ask questions. You have about 3 minutes to do this, and during that time, more information is going to appear on the screen. And this is from a real website. So you'll get more information, you'll be able to infer more, and then I'm going to ask you all some questions. So go to it, your time begins now. Doesn't matter. It can be either way. Time. Okay. Time's up. Okay, question for prospective owners. What have you learned about Green Top? Anybody? Yes.
It appears to be some form of restaurant chain or local eatery.
Some form of restaurant chain or local eatery. Anything else?
Be something that's involved in the environmental, deal with like local sourcing and things like that.
Something involved with environmental activity, local sourcing, and so on. Anything else? What else? Yes?
Is it some sort of cooperative?
Some sort of cooperative. Uh-huh. Anything else? It's not built yet. Take a long time to be built, right?
It looks like it has pop-ups though. The Willie Street Co-op, for example. Oh no, that's a field trip, my bad. I thought it might be a pop-up.
Okay, no.
That next future, when it is set up, you'll get a card that will do something, but we don't know what it will give you.
Okay, so once it's set up, you'll get a card that will do something, but we don't know what that is.
Oh, you get a special note.
A special what?
A special note.
A special note, yes. You get mentioned with honor. We all know how good honorable mention is.
Also, if it's on the card that you get, who else sees it?
Who else sees it if it's on the card?
There's no-
Yeah. Okay. Another set of questions. This time, it's still for the prospectives, huh? But this is about the owner now, the owner that you were talking to. Are they married? You don't know. How many kids have they got? What part of town do they live in?
You only gave us 2 minutes to interview.
Three. Pardon? New Willie Street, okay, maybe. What political party do they support? Oh, the Greens, yeah. How many other ventures like Green Top has that person started? How many of them succeeded or failed? Don't know? So in asking the questions, you really stuck to the direct information here and tried to fill in the gaps, but didn't really fill in the background. Because we need to know if we're going to invest in something, you probably, besides wanting to know what are we investing in, you probably want to know who am I investing with? Who are my partners in this investment? What are they like? How much experience do they have? You know, if I'm going to risk my money in this, as the person I'm going in with, do they have a track record? And so on, right? Now, when we are preparing user assistance, we have to think, we're in an environment, and our product exists in an environment. And I have news for you. Your customers do not spend all day with your product. You know, they have other things that happen. They get interrupted. They have other tasks that they have to do. They go to meetings and so on. And what happens when they go away from your product in the middle of a task because their boss has called them, or maybe they just have to go to the bathroom, and then they come back? Can they pick up easily? Do they have the context? Do they have enough information that they can keep in their heads? Can they remember where they are? Or do they have to go back and start a calculation or a whole procedure all over again because they've gotten lost? This is Green Top's homepage. And right away, you can get your gaps filled in about what Green Top is, and so on.
Where is it located?
Somewhere in the U.S., but I don't remember where. But the point being, when we're talking about reification, and this has to do with this notion of inferential learning, you have to give enough information. The bits that you had on the last screen were not quite enough information, were they, to understand this? So the point of the exercise is to try and understand how far do we go, how far do we need to go, how much information do we need to give in order to help people do the inference and learn, and to be able to do it quickly, because this is not a guessing game. People want help and they want it fast. So we have to give them the kind of help that lets them deduce very quickly what they need to do, but gives them enough mental exercise that they're going to remember it the next time. Right? And that's tricky. And I suppose that it's also somewhat subjective and probably not the same for every user. So we just have to find a happy medium, and that happy medium probably runs a little bit more toward excessive information than to than too little. Better to have slightly too much than to have slightly too little. In this case, at least that would be my my thought. I don't know if any of you have some ideas, or if you've already been through this kind of exercise. Anyone?
Yeah, I'd say that the problem with the information that we had was that there was no, like here now we can see exactly what green top is.
Hmm.
Now, if you'd actually had this information from the start, then you can infer quite a lot of things.
Correct.
That's at this level that extra information is probably needed, whereas in the actual steps of how to achieve something, probably you can cut back on the event. Like your example of using a screwdriver, I want to say screwdriver.
Right. So just for those who didn't hear, the notion is that if we'd had this first, the exercise would have gone quite a bit differently. Completely agree. Because this gives you, because there's a visual, and because you've got big type and so on, this gives you something that you can grab, again, in one go, right? You see the whole field, and then you get the detail, and the detail comes from all those little bits, which in the actual web page are down here.
So are you saying that conceptual, kind of contextual information is more effective? Or?
Well, what I'm saying is that if the first information that we give, and maybe it's in a tooltip or something like that, the first thing that people see needs to give them enough context that they can then decide where to go. And I'll talk about that some more as we go on. And some other aspects of Gestalt that we use all the time is in interface design. So there are notions of grouping. We have the notion of proximity. Objects that are close to each other are perceived as being alike because they form a group, right? We have the notion of similarity, whether you have radio buttons or check boxes. They're different types of objects. So and we've learned from habit and training that a radio button is a single choice and check boxes are multiple choices possible. But that's something that we've acquired. I mean, we take that almost for granted, but in fact, it's not something that's given. Very interesting thing, there was a study done on iconography in which very young people were shown, the usual symbol for a telephone. And they were asked, what is this? And they said, it's a telephone. And they said, how do you know? I said, because that's what we've learned. They hadn't seen a telephone that looked like that. The typical dial telephone and so on. That's for us old folks. But kids, and there's a video out there on YouTube of two adolescent girls who were just shown a telephone, a dial telephone, trying to figure out what you do with it. It's really funny. And of course, they do get it because they're not dumb. They get it. They work it out for themselves. But the process of working it out is really fascinating and amusing. So what we see here is that there's a tendency that individuals have as they perceive the world to try to eliminate complexity, to simplify things, to refine them down to an easy to grab reality. And that helps us to create meaning. And then there's the question, which is very common in user interface design, of affordance. And the official definition of affordance is, I'm going to read this, an action possibility available in the environment to an individual, independent of the individual's ability to perceive this possibility. So that means that an affordance exists whether or not you perceive that it exists. Now, interestingly enough, Donald Norman from Nielsen Norman, in his own explanation of affordance, went the step farther and said, you do need to perceive it. And in interface design, I think we would all probably agree that it's better that you can perceive the affordance than to not. But the notion of affordance is built around the possibility of action. And that's another way in which we fill in gaps, is that we see that something can be acted on. For example, a button. A button is an affordance. We can see that there's something that we have learned from our experience, that's something you can click on. That's an action. That's an action possibility. A checkbox, any of these things, any of these fields. Whether or not we actually act on them, we can see that we can possibly act on them. And that's important. So from Gestalt, we move to another learning theory, which is called constructivism. And constructivism, I think, is interesting and important for us in the work that we do, because it relates to first-hand experience, stuff that we get in the field that is perceived to be trustworthy because we get it from our own experience. And it means that learners are self-directed. And when we are dealing with software and user assistance, we are dealing with self-directed learners, right? So the question is, do we always actually manage to do this? Do we always manage to give this to our users? This kind of self-directed learning experience. That would be the objective, but the question is, do we actually achieve it? It also means that instructors are not teachers, that is not somebody who stands up here like I'm doing and dispenses knowledge, but are facilitators, people who help the user get their own information. And in our case, that facilitator is the user assistance itself, right? A user is in front of a piece of software, needs to figure out what to do, and goes to the user assistance, we hope, and is therefore looking for some kind of information. If the user assistance simply says, do this, do that, is that enough? Is that going to do the job? Is that actually facilitating the user's experience? The context in which learning takes place is central to the learning, and of course the context is the product that we are writing about. And the notion is also that learning is an active social process, and that learners need to collaborate to arrive at shared understanding. And this is a question that I've been asking. I don't have a quick and ready answer to this question yet, but the question is, what are we doing, or what can we or should we do, because I don't think we do enough, to actually encourage our users to talk to each other? you know, to say, hey, you know, I'm trying to figure something out. Alice Jane. Forums. I'm going to get to that. Forums aren't enough, in my view.
They're hateful, but you know.
Well, but that's exactly because they're hateful that they aren't enough. I think there's a better way than forums. But I'm also talking about just, hey, the person in the next cubicle, right? You know, do we ask questions do we ever ask a question in our user assistants? Do we ever actually challenge a user? Say, how would you do this? Or why would you do this? Or why is it interesting? Well, it depends. It might annoy them. It's absolutely true. It's a question that we need to ask ourselves. But also, the question is it worth annoying them if they learn it better? Depends on whether you're willing to interact with them and give them an answer. I would agree with that. And by the end of this session, you'll have some ideas, at least that come from me, about how and why and when we do that. So, how can we organize it? As a setting for all this, just a thought. I think most of us like to think that we write, let's say, in a traditional sort of static manual, right? Paper manual, PDF, output, etc., which is, I think, still the paradigm that we have, even if that's not what most of us do anymore. It's still the paradigm that we have. And I think most of us think that when we write one of these things, what we're doing is we are elucidating, we're giving additional meaning to the product and about the product. But in fact, I would suggest to you that it's just the opposite. It's the product that gives meaning to the document. The document is like a movie script. If you read it, it doesn't tell you what the movie's going to be like. It doesn't tell you what the experience of watching the movie is. It tells you certain manipulations that you can do, certain acts that you can do in order to make a movie. But it doesn't give you the movie. On the other hand, performance, the actual filming of the movie, is when you actually realize the experience. And that's when you make the experience that your users are going to have when they actually use the product. So the notion of a disembodied manual that somebody reads when they're away from the product, how useful is that? How much learning goes on there? Right? How much information do we acquire? In fact, I would suggest that the real meaning is embedded in the notion of action, in the notion of actually doing something. So now, we're going to do something. Whoops. You need 2 sheets of paper. So right away, please take one. One sheet of paper. Not a sheet of paper that you want to keep because you're going to destroy it. Okay, everybody got your paper? Paper? Everybody got one? Okay, do this. Fold it. Fold it again. Fold it a third time. Tear off a corner. Tear off another corner. Tear off 3 corners. Okay? Everybody got a paper that looks like this? Okay, open it up. Have you got this? Some people do, some people don't. Okay. Another piece of paper, please. Okay, everybody got your second piece of paper? Fold it once. One of these days I'll learn how to do this. Twice. Thrice. All right, now I want you to find the corner that has all the folds. And I want you to tear that off. Now I want you to tear off the corner next to it. On the short end. And then the next corner on the long end.
One with the folds or one without folds?
Either. I actually don't care. Okay. Open up. Everybody's got 3 holes, right? What's the difference between the 2 procedures we just followed? Pardon? The level of instruction. The detail, right? So, in the first one, we didn't say, and somebody actually asked the question the first time around, which corner? Which you'll notice I studiously avoided answering. And for a reason. That is that we're asking people, in this case, to just do something, and they fill in the gaps, right? They then have an experience which produces either this or something like it that isn't exactly identical, maybe with 1 hole or 2 holes, etc. In the second one, we gave a more explicit level of instruction, that is, a more step-by-step and more organized instruction that enabled people to reproduce exactly the same thing, or pretty close anyway. The question again is, what level of behavior do we need to reproduce in order to do what it is that we need to do, the task that we need to do in our user assistance? So you might actually need to say, tear off this particular corner, the one that has all the folds. That's actually the key. That's the key to having the 3 holes in the middle. Or you might not need to say that. You might just be happy that there are 3 corners torn off, in which case that's all the information you need to give. The whole idea of what I have often referred to as Kanban information, and Kanban is not only just in time. The idea is all the information you need, but only the information you need, right? So if you don't need it, you don't have to give it, and delivered in the right place at the right moment. So I think most of us would probably agree that people learn best by doing. Anybody that doesn't think so? I didn't think so. The question is, people learn by doing things and making connections in the process, but is rote memorization the best way to get at that? And then there's the question of, how do I even know that I need to do this task? Because our software is getting, and not only software, I should have said right at the outset, I'm talking about software, but a lot of what I'm talking about is generalizable to machine industries and other kinds of products in one way or another. And our products are getting so complicated and so complex that quite often, before we even start on a task, we need some sort of decision support that tells us, why is it interesting to do this task? Because if I learn that I don't need to waste my time doing a task that in the middle I'm going to suddenly discover, oh, this isn't what I wanted to do, that's useful. Because time is valuable. So we have to also, besides just telling people what to do, we have to tell them why it's interesting to do it, or not, as the case may be. We have to help them, in fact, make decisions about, do I do this task? When do I do this task? When do I need to initiate it? And maybe I don't need to do it at all. So, everybody seen this sometime or other? As a user, probably. So, the question is it helpful? And especially, what impression does it give a user of your company if they get this? Yeah. The company doesn't care, or the company, we spend hours and hours of effort making beautiful websites and great marketing collateral and so on. And then somebody gets the product, and I don't know if you ever had this experience as a kid. You see toy ads on the TV and it looks really great, and then you get it home, and as you're taking it out of the box, your stomach goes down to your feet because you know it's not going to be like it was on the TV, right? I mean, lots of kids have had this experience. I certainly did. And to some extent, when our products do this, that's what we're doing. Because we don't put our content strategy into our product. And one of the most important things that we can do for our users is help them when they get in trouble, to get out of it, right? Either to give them a way to back up or to solve it, troubleshoot. And John Carroll tells us this is one of the major important principles of minimalism is troubleshooting. How many people here think that minimalism is about reducing the volume of stuff you write? Good. I'm really glad to see that nobody thinks that. It is quite often, and Carroll says this, it is quite often a result of practicing minimalism that you reduce the amount of stuff you write, but it's not the objective. The objective is to help people learn fast in the way that they learn best and to get out of trouble when they get into it. So, pair up again. You can use the same pair you did the last time, and just tell each other about difficulty that you've had using a technological product and how it made you feel. Just do that right now. Just take a minute or two. And make a list of those emotions. So write it down. Write down a list. Very important. Write it down on paper, the emotions. Yeah. Not what happened to you, the emotions, write down. No, just make a list of the emotions. Only the emotions. Okay. Time? Okay, just call out randomly emotions that you've got on your list. Disappointed. Angry. Frustrated. Pardon? Wasting time. I'm sorry, say that again? Jubilation. When you figure it out, okay. Annoyed. Ignored. Remorse. I'm going to have to ask you about that, Max. Lost. Really quite dreadfully put out. I love that. All right. You now have a tool, a working tool, that you can actually take back to your job. Because if you've got anywhere in your product, in your company's product, if you've got messages that have the effect of the one that I just put up a little while ago, you can show that to your developers, to your product managers, and say, this is how people feel when they see that. Is that what we want? Is that what we want our customers to think about us? Because once they've bought your product, the customers are not looking at your website. The customers are not reading your marketing collateral. The customers are looking at your product. And your product is the major communications channel that your company has with them. This is so important. Anybody who thinks that TechCom is not marketing has got it wrong. It's not that we're trying to sell the product in our technical documentation. That's not the point. But we need to make those users happy. Because if we don't, they aren't going to buy it. And if they don't buy our products, we are going to be out of jobs. So it's really important to think about that, about how do we make our users happy. And so this is a tool. And it's so easy to do. Just think about experiences you've had. You know, how many people have seen, there's a field that's marked file name, and you go to the help, and it says, enter the file name here. Thank you very much. If I need help on a field name, file name, it's because I don't know what the devil a file name is. And you aren't telling me that. So, we're looking for performance-based meaning. We're looking for meaning that's embedded in action. And that means we need concepts and decision support. But we also say people learn best by doing. Isn't there a conflict there? How do we teach concepts by doing? The answer is we put the concepts where they're going to be useful and also where they're going to be remembered. And I call this double embeddedness. Because first, we need to embed procedural user assistance directly into the interface. And I think more and more people are doing that. I don't think that that's a controversial thing to be saying anymore. But something that is perhaps a little bit controversial and that breaks one of the sort of holy tenets of TechCom is we have to embed the concepts in the user assistance, in the procedural user assistance. That is, the notion that you have to separate out conceptual information and task-based information is, in my view, wrong. It's not that we don't distinguish between them, we have to. But Mark Baker wrote a blog post in which he talks about pizza. And he says, it's very important if you want a pizza to know what it's made of. You have to know what toppings you want, whether you want red pizza or white pizza, double cheese, mushrooms, green peppers, and so on. But that doesn't mean that you want your pizza to be delivered with all those components separated. You still want the pizza to be an entire thing that mixes, right? The taxonomy is one thing. Knowing what is procedural information and what is conceptual information and being able to tag it semantically is very important. But that doesn't mean that we have to serve it up separately, right? Like the pizza. This is really, really, in my view, critical stuff. And it's backed up by the kind of principles that I'm explaining today. And John Carroll himself says this. He doesn't say we don't need conceptual information. What he says is people are not going to read long conceptual tomes that are separated out from the actions that they need to solve their immediate business problem. So what do? We embed just a few words. We don't need a lot. It can be a couple of sentences. Right in a step, right? So you say, do this. The reason you're doing it is because it's going to give you that. Well, that's useful information, and that's conceptual. And not only that, if you look at a data model like DITA, for example, it's in there. It lets you do it. You do not break the semantic structure by doing it. It has components that allow you to do it. So it's not, it's not that we never talk about concepts in the middle of a procedure. We do. But we're not going to give paragraphs and paragraphs. We're just going to tell people what they need to know right now, enough for them to generalize. So this is a scheme about learning by doing, done by Roger Schenck, who's a cognitive scientist and a learning theorist, in which he attempts to explain what happens when we learn by doing. So here we have 3, what he calls memory organization packets. Originally he called them scenarios, but he changed the name because he said a scenario is self-contained, and these are really not completely self-contained. These are as it were, envelopes or containers that are made up of little scenes. And the scenes can be generalized from one organization packet or MOP to another. I'll give you an example. Here we have 3, restaurant, airplane, and clothing shop. 3 different situations or scenarios that we could participate in. Let's look at the restaurant. We have a number of scenes in the restaurant. One of them is being seated. Another is choosing what we're going to eat. Another one is paying for what we've selected. And of course, eating. Right? All of these same scenes also take place in the airplane organization packet. We take our seats. We eat often on a flight, especially a long flight. We choose what flight we're taking. We might choose what we're going to eat if we're on a transatlantic flight or something like that. And we pay for it. And we can say that if we make, let's say, a mistake paying for a restaurant meal with a credit card, we can probably generalize to paying for an airplane ticket with a credit card and not make the same mistake. No? Because the procedure is the same, basically. So we have this. Now, let's look at the clothing shop. In the clothing shop, there are only 2 scenes from the other 2 that are applicable. On the other hand, in each of these scenes, we have some things that are specific. For example, in the airplane or in the restaurant, serving wine to your companion at table, right? which you would do in a restaurant, you probably wouldn't do in an airplane. Probably it would be the flight attendant who would pour the wine for you if you've paid the exorbitant prices that they ask for, usually bad wine. On the other hand, in the airplane you have fasten your seatbelt. You wouldn't do that in a restaurant or in a clothing shop, although you might do it in an automobile. But we don't have the automobile MOP here. In the clothing shop, you have trying things on, right? That you don't do in a restaurant. Well, some people do, then they send it back. But as a rule, we don't. And some people do try on food, but usually it's not intentional.
Somebody else helps them.
Yeah, somebody helps them, exactly. All right, now, then there's another situation. This gets complicated. Here we have a little scene called romantic conversation. Romantic conversation can take place in a restaurant. It also can take place in an airplane or a clothing shop, right? But in fact, the romantic conversation has nothing that makes it intrinsically a part of any of these. So it's just something that goes on, as it were, simultaneously, and it might be part of an MOP that's called romance or courtship, right? To which it is intrinsic. So we have in any of these things, we have scenes that form a part, an intrinsic part of what it is, and then there are other scenes that may go on at the same time, but aren't intrinsically a part of it. Now think about how that might apply when we're trying to construct user assistance. When you're doing something, and remember again that your customers are not spending all their time manipulating your product. So they get interrupted, they have other things they have to do, the phone rings, etc. So, before selecting seats, you have to make a decision, right? Decision support. So when you arrive at our restaurant, your greeter will assign you a table. If space permits, you can choose an available table that is suitable for your party. That's the restaurant scenario. On the airplane side, you select one. Usually, let's say you're doing this online, right? Airline assigns seats for my party. I will select seats for my party and probably pay for it, right? So the question here is, what can we tell the user that will help the user make the decision as to which of these they want to do, whether it be the restaurant or the airplane, anyone. What could we offer to a user to say this or that or that? A seating chart that will help them decide whether they want to.
Window, aisle, or I think the airplane.
Mm-hmm.
But review the information whether they have to pay.
Whether they have to pay or whether it's free. Yeah? Reviews. Yeah, you know, some of you may have seen this. There are airline sites now where they actually review, there are customer reviews of each individual seat in a given model of an airplane. I find this mind-boggling, but it exists. Anything else?
You can provide a default option which they can accept and go further. So something is already ticked and
Mm-hmm.
that's fine with me.
So you can provide a default, which they can say, that's fine, I don't need to go any farther, or I don't like that. Both in the airplane and in the restaurant, the question of whether you're near the restroom might have something to do with it, right?
And whether you trust your supplier, I'm sorry,
Uh.
whether you trust the supplier, because I sometimes look at reviews and think,
Uh-huh.
kind of tell.
All right, how would you make, how do you know what's a plant and what's authentic? How do you,
Horrible cynicism
horrible cynicism.
I have in spades.
Mhm. Yeah.
If you're, I think you need to find out whether the party has any special requirements, like people with wheelchairs.
Ah, that's a very good point. Are there special requirements? People with wheelchairs, people with mobility problems, people with vision or hearing problems?
And if there are these problems, are they actually supported by?
And is it supported in the situation? We, of course, have the same kind of questions in designing user assistance, and there are questions of accessibility. We use color coding quite a lot. What about colorblind people? Do we have something else like position that can substitute? There are a whole host of questions. I worked for a while for a company that produced dental imaging and practice management software. The question of accessibility is kind of interesting because you have to ask yourself, how many dentists are there with reduced mobility? I actually don't know the answer to that question. There could be more than we think. It's not impossible to practice dentistry with reduced mobility. It depends how that mobility is reduced. And of course, the question of colorblindness applies no matter what. So these questions are important. Now what I've done here is I've turned the selection process into a series of technical communicator steps. So, to select seats in this restaurant, prerequisite, you are in the restaurant. 1, identify the greeter. Result, a smile opens on the greeter's face. Smile back. Tell the greeter how many in your party and what area of the restaurant you prefer. Follow the greeter to your table and take your seats. If you are not happy with the greeter's suggestion, repeat steps 2 through 4 until you are satisfied.
2 is very important.
Yes. Okay, now let's look at the same thing, selecting seats for a flight. Right? Again, the assumption is that this would be done online. There would be, some variations if you were doing this in person, but since I think most people these days do it online, that's the scenario I chose. So prerequisite, you are logged into your internet airline account and your reservation page is displayed. Click Select Change Seats. The seat map opens. Not quite the same as the smile on the greeter's face, but select the first passenger for whom you want to select a seat. Which also might be the last if you're the only passenger, but the legend on the seat map indicates available and occupied seats. Click an available seat. For each remaining passenger, select the next name and repeat step 3. So this is obviously simplified because there might be, premium seats that you have to pay extra for that you could select and so on. So there might be all kind of branching things, but I've tried to keep this simple, all right? So the question is, and then click continue. So the question is, what information in one of these tasks would be useful in generalizing to the other? Pardon? How many there are in the party? That would be one, certainly. Whether seats are available or unoccupied, or occupied rather. Yeah.
Suitability of the seats for you.
Suitability of the seats for you,
Yeah.
like the situation we were just discussing of accessibility and so on.
And if there's 2 of you and you want to sit together, you have to have 2 seats.
Yeah, and if there are 2 of you, you might want 2 seats together, especially in a restaurant.
I suppose the loop is common from that, isn't it?
Pardon?
The loop is common from that.
The loop is common also, yes. the fact that it's a recycled process that you go through. So there's a lot here. If these are each a scene in two different MOPs, you can see that there's a lot here that we can, using the concepts of filling in the gaps, the generalizations that we make, we can assume, if we understand this process, we can generalize fairly easily to this process, even though this is one that we do in a person-to-person situation, in a social situation, and this is one that we do online. So we have, through this capacity, this holistic capacity that the brain has, we have this capacity to make a generalization, actually sometimes a rather large generalization, from one thing to another, where there's a resemblance. Now we also have to ask the question, what makes these things different? Because sometimes, in some situations, when we're designing user assistance, we also have to identify that. And if we're using some sort of structured authoring system, whether it be Ditto or something else, we also need to know what do we want or need to reuse, just what level of detail of reuse is useful, because sometimes, even though what we're trying to do is avoid cut and paste, sometimes cut and paste is still better than trying to reuse 3 words from the middle of a sentence just because we can, right? So the question is, how far do we go? Here are the cat videos. This is learning by doing. These 2 videos are the same cat, but different eras. And so the first one we're going to look at is the one on your left, which is the cat learning a game, which is actually an iPad game for cats. And so this is the cat just sort of feeling its way around with this game, which is where he has to prevent these little animated mice from getting the cheese that's in the middle of the screen. And what you can see is the cat sometimes tries to bite the little mice. Sometimes you'll see he licks his paws to see if he's actually got mice on his paws. Right?
So unfair.
Now, in the second video, the cat has learned it's a game and likes it. And you'll see very different sort of behavior. And the game has audio feedback. There's a bell that rings each time he gets one of the mice. Now, this is fun.
He's still trying to bite them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's more playful than in the first video. There he's paused the game. So. Yeah.
Is there a third video where you orders mice from them on Pepsi?
So there's an example of experiential learning, learning by doing, and by making inferences. If you think about it, going from what we see in the first video to what we see in the second requires a large generalization, because it's going from saying, well, what's this? I'm not quite sure. Are these real mice or are they not? Or why can't I touch them? Why can't I taste them? To understanding that it's a game. That's actually a big jump. It's a big cognitive leap. So what we're seeing is, if a cat can do it, so can our users, right?
depends on the intelligence level of the user compared to the cat.
This is a cat person speaking. So, this is where we take our little bio break, and let's take maybe 5 minutes, and then we're going to come back and talk some more about learning by doing. There's got to be somewhere. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The show will resume in just 1 minute. All right, so we've looked at, as it were, aspects of content, the actual stuff, the learning by doing. But there's also a question of context. And context is everything, as you can see. So, the fact is, generalizing from one MOP to another is completely linked to the ability of any one user to switch contexts. And sometimes it means, in switching contexts, we have to unlearn something. Unlearning is not something we're mostly used to. Most people think it's a bad idea. But the fact is that given the complexity of society and the accelerating rates of change, we're unlearning things all the time. Think about all the habits you have today that completely contradict habits that you had even 10 years ago. Right? We have unlearned a great deal of things, or we've relearned, right? So, here's a little exercise. Very quickly, just say out loud.
5 minus 2 equals
Equals what? 3. That is a context change, right? We can do the simple addition really quickly in our heads. We could probably go even 2 and 3 digits without too much trouble. But when we get to this level, we can't do it without either sitting down and doing a manual calculation or using a calculator. So that represents a context change. So it's important then, if we are asking users to change context, and we are very often in our products, we have to allow them somehow to make connections, which means we have to give them a hook to grab onto, something they can use to make the transition. If we're generalizing from restaurant to airplane, we need to give them something that tells them, number one, they're supposed to, and number two, helps them find the path that will allow them to do that. And as I said earlier, it doesn't necessarily mean providing a whole lot of detail. Too much detail will, in fact, be confusing and obfuscatory. So, let's come back to our MOPs here and start looking at what happens when we start learning a lot of these different little scenes. We start creating networks. So we have a pay network, for example. And I don't mean Visa or MasterCard. I mean simply a network that we create in our minds that connects the contexts in which we have the pay scene and interlinks them and provides those hooks that allow us to change context. We also have an eat network, and we might even include the wine serving scene, which is not, in this case, amongst these three contexts, common to any others, in our eat network. And of course, we have a choosing network. And then what happens is that as we start building these mental structures, they start communicating with each other. So we have choosing and eating. Well, obviously, then we might construct a choosing food kind of structure. And the same thing for all these other connections. Another thing that we can do is we can start grouping these experiences according to certain aspects of our opinion, affect, and so on. So we might say restaurant and clothing shop get grouped into something that we describe as things we like, whereas the airplane, or at least speaking for myself, is something I don't specifically like, and I spend a lot of time on airplanes and I hate it. So that's interesting, but then we can go yet another step of complexity farther, which is that we can extract some of these scenes from their current context and create a new context that we call wine bar, right? Which is composed of serving wine, paying, eating, but also this was try on here, and here it becomes just slightly metamorphosized into try out, right? So we go from try on to try out, right? It's the same idea. It's a generalization, but it's a generalization which includes a slight linguistic jump, at least in English, because, for example, if you were in French, it would be essayer in both cases. So it wouldn't be a linguistic change in French. So it depends on your language also. And of course, our cognitive structures are built around the languages we speak. So here we have this notion that we're now functioning at a meta level, right? And this happens to our users too. The more expert they become with our products, the more they do this, which is very important also to keep in mind, and I'm going to come back to this notion of expertise and expert users. So, questions here. If we learn about seat selection in a restaurant, if that's the way that we learn that particular scene, are we learning something specific to the MOP restaurant? What do you think? Sometimes.
Some restaurants work differently anyway. So
Different restaurants work differently, right. Are we learning something generalizable to multiple MOPs? A scene called seat selection, for example, is that something that we're doing? What do you think?
I think there is some generalizable idea in it.
Yeah, some of it is generalizable. Third question, are we learning something about some more abstract MOP that actually isn't related to either seat selection or restaurant, but is called judgment?
Sure. We're figuring out what's reasonable.
Yeah. So we're making judgments about what's reasonable in seat selection. We were talking earlier about the fact that you might even need to know that it was possible to select seats, because in some situations it might not be, right? So, and this is what is really important for us in our profession. Which of these is true in any given situation has to do with how you architect the user's experience. And when I say you, I mean you, technical communicator, but also working together with interaction designers, programmers, and so on. Because it's that ensemble of actions that determine how that cognitive process works for any given user. It's the architecture that we design. And that's why all of this stuff is important, for people like us. So here you can look at a kind of spiral of cognition. And some of you have undoubtedly seen this diagram before because I use it a lot. And so if we have a scale here, where on one side we have the cognitive and symbolic complexity, on the horizontal axis, richness of content going up. And if we look at this spiral as going along an axis that represents both opportunity to do something and actual practice, that is, the actual seizing of the opportunity, what we see is that as we go up, we constantly come back to the same place, but on a higher plane. That's why it's a spiral. And we can look at these sequences and say that at the bottom, we're looking at just a simple capacity to receive explicit information. This is the level at which we memorize something and then we repeat it, what we've memorized. As we go up, as we gain cognition, we start to acquire the capacity to interpret the information that we've memorized. So we start to, and maybe we even start to think, oh, I could think of a quicker way to do that or a different way to do that, and so on. And then we get to where we can apply and use not just the explicit information, but the implicit interpretation that we've made of that information. So we've now gotten, at this stage, to the place where we can actually make use of stuff that until now has just sort of been in a database in our heads, right? Now we're not just using the database, but we're putting it together and applying it in different ways. So we're making a much more explicit use. Now then, we get to a higher level, and this is where it really gets interesting. This is where we have the ability not only to use it, but to actually evaluate it. To say, well, this could be better if it were done in such and such a way, or if it were, this could be explained better, etc. And when we're really, really sharp, we can also talk about how that content is delivered and make comments on that. And that's really interesting for us, because if we have users who can do that, that means, number one, they're experts. They probably can't get it wrong. And number two, they can give us feedback that will help us do it better and build better products. So we really want our users to be up here. We have every interest for them to be up there. We make them happy, and we make them loyal. And they give us stuff back. What more could you want? Right? These steps mirror more or less the steps that are in Bloom's taxonomy, which some of you probably know about. They're more or less analogous. There's one step less in my list than there is in Bloom's, but pretty much it's the same thing. Now, this is another one of my favorite diagrams. This is where we graph stuff that we do all the time. So let's say on the left here of this horizontal axis, we have thematic knowledge, the kind of knowledge that an engineer or some other SME might have. And on the right, we have the code that we're asking our users to learn. I don't mean programmer's code, I mean the code of the interface and so on, right? It's mastery of language, iconography, and so on. Then we create a vertical axis, which on the bottom is simply memorization, procedural memorization, like the bottom of that cognitive spiral. And at the top is our actual reasoning and ability to construct new cognitive processes for ourselves, right? So now we have an X and Y axes, but there's also a Z axis. And at this end of it, we have the kind of context that many of our users find themselves in much of the time, which is simple, immediate, contingent need. I have a business problem that I need to solve it now. I don't care about any of the rest of it, right? And at the other end, we have this kind of sociocultural thing, it's where I alluded to asking questions and encouraging sharing. This is where our users become mentors for other users. They involve themselves in a community, and they both acquire and emit useful information that is shared in the community. And so if we put a cube around these axes, we can say this is a user learning space. The question that we need to ask ourselves when we are constructing different bits of our user assistance is, where do we want them to be inside this space? What kind of information are we going to give them so that they are properly placed for the moment at which they're acquiring this particular information in that space? And when? Because it isn't always appropriate for them to be in the same space all the time. Sometimes they need to get this done, right? And that's what we need to give them, and only that. There are other times when they need this. They need this because they need to be able to interact with their colleagues, to interact with a community, to take part in something, and maybe to interact with developers, product managers, and other people in order to improve what's going on. Once again, we are the architects of where people find themselves in that space. We design that. Nobody else can do that. Only we can. That's a huge responsibility, a privilege, and, by the way, a value that we have that sometimes our bosses don't understand or recognize, but it is value. This is the corner where you find your most expert users. And we want expert users for reasons that I'm now going to go into. The last of the cognitive theories that I'm going to give you is also the newest. This theory, which is called connectivism, learning theory, was developed by a Canadian named Stephen Downes, and I recommend going to his website, his blog, if you're interested in this stuff, because it's full of stuff. He's an educator, so he's treating it from the point of view of, say, schools and education. But if you look at his stuff, it's all about society, it's about culture, and so on. Stephen Downes, D-O-W-N-E-S. Stephen with a P-H. Basically, the tenets of connectivism say that knowledge is out there in the world, and it's a part of the world. It's not just something that's in your head. It's part of the world as a whole, and that it exists through people participating in activities. It's a process. And it involves creating connections and forming networks, right? So learning is about interaction. And learning as a process is more important than knowing. So his idea is not what you got stuffed into your head, memorized, but your capacity to acquire the information you need at the moment that you need it. And therefore, perceiving connections is a core skill. Now, I used to be a journalist before I was in this business. And at the CBC in Canada, I was considered to be a very fast researcher. I never told anybody. That was absolute crap. I wasn't a fast researcher. I was a lazy researcher. I didn't like doing research. But what I did have was what I used to call a garbage collector's mind. I just had my head packed with all these dumb little factoids. I couldn't help it. I didn't do it deliberately. It just happened. I would just collect all this stupid information, and I would say to people, did you know that? And people say, oh yeah, there he goes again, right? But every once in a while, one of those would come in that would just drop into place, that would suddenly go bingo, and all kind of things that didn't seem to be connected to each other suddenly got connected. And that was what made me into a so-called fast researcher, was just that ability to do that. I had that instinctively. Some people do, but some people don't, but you can still learn how to do it. It's a learnable process. And we're going to do that in a little bit. So, staying current and up to date is the most important part of learning activities, according to this theory. And that requires nurturing your networks. And that's really important for us. So, these are some of the essential components that come out of being a connectivist. It's having know-how, know what, know where, and know when. But also implied in that is know how to be and know how to be with others. These are things that, these are essential things, for education, certainly for educating our young before we eat them. But it's also important for us in the context of technological products. I'm sure you've all heard more than once, oh, technology is so inhuman, it's awful, it's soul-destroying, etc. Well, we are the people that help to socialize this stuff and to make it human, to make it accessible, and hopefully to have it be used in some way that is productive and useful for, the world. So all of this stuff is very, very significant. Now, another diagram. This one is based on the European Union's defined levels of linguistic competency. And it's important for us because a lot of what we do is still language-based. So, the first set of levels you see here, the beginner level, that's the literal content. That's equivalent to that memorization. We get to a basic level. This is where we start actually being able to communicate. The interesting level is what's called B1, which is the cognitive level. That's where you start to really be aware. And one of the things that you are aware of at that level is, God, there's so much more I need to learn. That's the scary part. I don't know If you guys have this, I have it with every project I undertake. There is a moment always of panic. It's like when I look at all there is to do, and I think, I am never going to be able to do all this. I'm not competent. I don't have enough time. I'm not going to learn all this stuff. Fortunately, I've done it long enough that I know that this too shall pass. And it does. But there's always this moment of doubt and confusion. And it's the moment in which you become conscious about all there is to learn. Going on, we have the advanced levels. So by the time we get to B2, we're forming communities, that is networks, and we start working on things like complexity and selection of criteria. That's where we start with this idea of evaluating the message and the way in which it's delivered. What happens is that once the quantity of information that we're dealing with, or that we need to deal with, goes beyond our immediate contingent need. That is that need of how do I solve this now? Oop, sorry, this thing just... we get confused. We even might have a sense of chaos. And that's what makes it difficult. That's a bump we have to get over. And that happens at this level here. Right? So first there's the panic, and then there's the chaos. Right? But what we have to remember is, no matter how much there is to learn, as we learn more, we're still gaining, right? Buckminster Fuller once said, every time we make an experiment, we learn more. We cannot learn less. I love that. We cannot learn less, short of brain damage. So complexity does not mean chaos. We want to keep things simple. We want to make things as simple as we can for our audience, our users. But sometimes as simple as we can make it is still very complex. And our job is to weave our way, thread our way through this web of complexity and to help people understand how they can do it too. So, we're going to play a card game. And my friend Christopher here is going to help. We're about to distribute a set of cards, 5 cards for each of you. So let's just do that, and then we'll get into what we do with them. You want to give me half the deck, Chris, and I'll do that on the other side. Thanks. Okay, 2, 3, 4, 5. In Catalan, the word for blog is block.
I might be tweaking like a crazy person.
Make sure you've got 5. Take some cards. It's your deck. Don't blame the dealer if you got a lousy hand.
I've got 6. Do you
8
want one
more?
back?
Take them off the top. Good.
You gave me 6.
I gave you 6? Yeah, I want one back. Thank you. Okay. 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5. There you go. That's your hand. The numbers, don't worry about. They were for me. Okay. Everybody got 5 cards? Good. So, first, it says 6 up there, but it's 5. Organize your deck in order from highest priority to lowest for you personally. Each card has a word, some words or phrases that can relate to a business situation. Some of them are TechCom specific. Some of them could apply to any kind of organization. Doesn't matter. Order them in your personal priority from highest to lowest. It'll take just a little while to do that. Okay, everybody got it? Okay, just take 1 minute on the clock, to compare your priorities with the people on either side of you. It's just an informal comparison, huh? Okay, starting now. When we get to the diagram stuff, can you just help go around and making sure that people get what they're supposed to do with the diagram? Yeah, yeah. Okay, time. Time. Whoa. Okay, now the fun part comes. Because anybody here used to collect trading cards of any kind? Sports players or movie stars or whatever? Well, this is what we're going to do now. We're going to trade. So the idea is that you're going to exchange cards with whomever. You can float around, you can move around the room. But the idea is that you want to assemble a deck, because obviously you've seen from looking at your neighbors, you don't all have the same cards, right? So the idea is you are going to try, by doing exchanges, to assemble your ideal deck. That is the deck that has your real top 5 priorities, right? So you have 2 minutes to do this. 2 minutes starting now.
Sounds very busy.
Yeah,
What card sorting? Oh, how fun.
they're trading cards. They're trading priorities.
This is really good. Okay. You're doing well. You got till 1. You're fine. Super. Thank you so much for coming. We do appreciate it.
Oh, I enjoy it. I enjoy it.
Good.
This is fun too, doing this.
All right. Yeah. What do you think of my Adobe Illustrator skills, creating these banners then?
Oh, you did this?
No, I mean, that's a board graphic and that's their logo. Putting them together and making them work. Yeah. So that's what we do. Okay. I'm trying to work out. I mean, a lot of people have been saying hello to me, and I don't know who they are. But once I get their labels, I'll say, "Oh, hello, John. Hello, Pete." You know.
Lots of it.
Your email, you sent, I mean, your circular email about the Transformation Society, another survey you want me to do, which I'll get to. So.
Thank you, please do. And join the webinar.
I'll try. It's not always easy.
Mm. 15 seconds. 15 seconds. Time. Time, gentlemen, time. Okay, traders, the trading session has ended. The closing bell has sounded. Yes. Going gone. Okay, everybody, traders all happy? No. Ah, funny thing about that, you don't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes you get what you need.
Dance while you say that.
Yeah, I know. Okay, but we're not done, huh? We're not done, because now what you're going to do is you're going to put yourselves together in groups of 4. And you're going to need paper again, because what you're going to do is you're going to make a diagram that looks like this. And here's what you put on the diagram. For each group, 1 paper for each group. So list all of your priorities, right? 1 in each quadrant. And then, and this is the challenging part, in the middle, you're going to put down why you have differences or similarities. Okay? So do that.
5 here, got 6 here. Somebody from over there.
Okay, so we need somebody from over here to join a group over here.
Yeah, 5 and 6 makes 11, so we get 1 more than 5 3 groups of 4.
Mm-hmm. Okay, groups of 4, 1 paper per group. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to actually make a list in each quadrant here of
For each person, so we have 1 paper per 1 paper.
1 paper per group,
So what will those do? 1 paper then?
right? So 1 paper per group, yeah, that's it. Okay. You need to get your diagram going. And it's just mechanical. You make the diagram and list each of your priorities on
We
it.
did. We put it on one of these pieces of paper, but then you said we had to write in the hole, and that was going to mean writing on the tablecloth.
How are we coming here? Right, so you need to just make lists and then fill in the why business in the middle.
It's open-minded management.
Ah, there you go. Collaborative effort. Good.
I used to have one. Better secretary. Okay, larger screen. What is this?
Okay, we got our lists done. We should be getting into the why business now. Hmm? Okay, we should be all filling in that center now with the why we have differences and similarities. Please try to be fairly explicit.
Well, my question was, the middle part, I guess we have to share with each other why we have differences. Sure, that's why you put it all in each sheet. Yeah, so that everybody can see.
Yes.
Were we supposed to look at each other's cards and decide
Pardon?
whether were we only supposed to list our priorities from our own cards, or were we supposed
Each,
to?
no, on one, each corner here is supposed to be a different person's set of priorities.
Okay. But using their own cards?
Yes.
Not looking at the other people's?
No. How are we coming here? Okay, we should be filling in that center now. Okay, let's take just another minute or two to fill in that the center. How are we doing? Just about done now with your whys? Okay, let's wind it up because we have another step to do yet. We're not done. No, we're not done. Okay, the next, well, this is a workshop. So remember, work is part of workshop. Okay, so now, what I would like you to do is to exchange your paper with another group. Trade papers, Right? Let's do it. Doesn't matter which group, but do remember where you got it from.
Yeah, just that's theirs, not ours.
Okay, everybody exchanged? So we're now going to do a little metadata exercise here in which you're going to read the paper you've just received and you're going to enter some sort of commentary or characterization of what you've read. Right? Whatever it is that you think characterizes the material that you're reading that comes from another group. So, and you're going to write it, please. You can write it in whatever form you want, so long as it's identifiable and readable. So, so
Like the examples he gives, humorous, pragmatic, idealistic. Now, this is a table exercise, so you all can agree on. Oh, I see.
yeah.
Is it aspirational?
Yes, exactly. Right? Okay. Anybody have any questions about the exercise, what you're supposed to do? Everybody clear? We're just going to take a couple of minutes to do this, so do it quite quickly, please. Right? Rely on your instincts. The first thing that comes to your head is probably right. I mean, there's no right and wrong, but the first thing that comes to your head is probably the best choice. Yeah, that's deliberate because I don't want to, but it's a few words like pragmatic, idealistic, humorous, whatever, Totally unrealistic. Right, just think of yourself as providing little meta tags to this information.
I think they initially have to get over the shock of having to pass their work to somebody else first. Most of them are sitting at the table going, oh my gosh, what did I write?
Yeah. But that's part of the exercise, too. Okay, time. Time, everybody. Now, the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to give the paper back to the group you got it from.
This is really annoying.
And then take a minute to read what the other group wrote about what you wrote. Right? Just take a moment to do that, because then I'm going to ask you something about it. There will be a quiz. Okay, everybody had a look? All right, my question, and I do want answers. How does it make you feel to read the comments of the other group? Validated, okay? Anyone else? Yes, validated? Everybody feels validated? Everybody's strutting their stuff? Any others? No other emotions? Everybody's just validated and that's it. God, what a monotonal group we have here.
We were justified that outrageous.
The fact is that any time we receive new information, we have to deal with emotional reactions. And you can well imagine that you might have gotten comments that were critical, right? As you might have gotten comments that you wouldn't appreciate all that much, right? So the fact is, we, again, as purveyors of information that is often new, we have to think about that, but also, and this is the important point related to connectivism and to making connections, is we also have to be in a position of receiving new information, and that new information that we receive may not make us feel all that good. I was talking in the break with someone about a film that exists that was done by one of the French universities, where they were filming people using household appliances for the first time. And one of the films showed a woman trying to program the clock on her microwave. And she followed the directions extremely literally, including putting in the number for the time that was in the illustration. And then she couldn't understand why it didn't show the right time, because she followed the instructions exactly. This, for people like us, should be humbling, because it means we haven't done our job. You know, I doubt very seriously that this was a totally stupid woman. Simply, she wasn't speaking our language, or we weren't speaking hers, which is more to the point. Right? And so, the question is, how do we learn to speak their language? Because we might think that we're perfectly clear, and we might be for us, or for people like us. But the question is our user like us? This is a comment that some of us are probably familiar with. We did great UA, but nobody uses it, or they can't find it, right? Part of the problem is they just don't know where to go, so where do? They go to Google. First instinct. Why do they go to Google? Pardon? Because it's easy to find things, exactly. And if they can't find it where we put it, there's a problem, no?
I like to go to Google because even though I'm a technical author and I ought to go to other stuff, I like to go to Google. One of the things about Google is it often gives, it describes problems from the point of view of people who are in a similar position to me.
Right, right. It's the point of view. It's people in a similar position. So, and that's the community aspect. That's the notion of sharing that I was talking about earlier. And that's why we also go to social networks, and it's why we crowdsource, right? So what's happening here is that our users are building a culture of information sharing and knowledge building. And this happens inside our organizations and outside them. And so out of our control. And what they're doing, in fact, is the users, in doing this process, they're decoding information and then recoding it to reconstruct it in a different manner that makes sense to them. So it becomes new knowledge. This means that if we really care about the user assistance that we're producing, first of all, it has to be Googleable, and not only that, it needs to come up first. Because presumably, if we've provided the information, we are, as it were, the horse's mouth. So if our information is the most accurate and the most reliable, we want that to be the first thing that comes up in the Google search. And I love this quote from Ian Barker, who's an information architect: finding is the new doing. I think that's really, really true. So the idea is not only to make your stuff Googleable, but because of just exactly the context question, people in the same position as I'm in, from the same point of view that I'm in, we need to create stakeholder communities. And by stakeholder communities, I mean both people inside the organization and people outside, and most especially users as full collaborators. And to come back to what Alice Jane said earlier, a user group or a forum is not a community. So we're not talking about user groups or forums. We're not talking about Facebook pages. We are talking about seriously integrated communities. And folks, this requires effort and it requires time. And I realize quite readily that many of us are not in a position to be able to initiate this on our own. So you have to be able to sell this to your management if you're going to do it. I'm going to explain that. Everyone is a stakeholder, first of all. Everyone. And therefore has equal rights, as it were. And that means internal and external, everyone, right? Including consultants and customers. And for the product managers, not the usual beta testers, the ones who will always tell you things you want to hear, because they like being in a privileged position. It can't be them, or it can include them, but it can't be exclusively them. So we have a certain number of very, very important objectives here. The first is that it has to be a completely collaborative, integrated community. And the idea is that this community creates value, and the value is re-injected into the system. And when I say the system, that includes product design. Right? Some of you are now probably getting to the point where you're going to say, this guy is talking utopia. This ain't going to happen. That may be the case in some companies, but there are some companies in which you can make it happen. And if you can make it happen, you're guaranteeing the future of your company. That I can tell you. So, first rule for all this, make your cookies public. Everybody knows that when you do a Google search, it's tracking you. But we don't know what they're tracking. Be transparent. Tell people what you're tracking and tell them why. Treat inside stakeholders and customers in exactly the same way. Give them the same respect, the same weight to their opinions, and attribute material that you reuse, whether it's in your UA or in your UI or whatever. Whether it comes from somebody inside or from somebody outside. Why? Because if you tell a customer, I'm using your suggestion, and it's going into the product, you've got a friend for life. You've got somebody who's going to talk up your product. You've got somebody who is not going to switch to another product because he or she knows that what they contributed, what they suggested, actually got used. It was listened to and it went into the product. You cannot get more loyalty than you get from doing that. And the fact is that even though that only happens to just a few people, it's sort of like playing the lottery. Everybody knows that your chances of winning the lottery are infinitesimal, but somebody wins, right? Well, it means that anybody that participates in this community has an equal shot at having their suggestion incorporated into the product. So you build a cognitive demand, an interest in participating because they know that stuff can happen. The other thing you can do is lots of times users have all kinds of tips and tricks. Now some of them are shortcuts that are really only applicable to their situation. You don't want to use those. never promise to use stuff just because somebody offers it. But do promise to take it seriously, and do take it seriously. And if it is reusable, if it's got legs, if it's applicable, it may or may not be correct. For example, if you're in a regulated industry, you have to be careful about that kind of stuff. So you don't just accept everything that comes in willy-nilly, but you do take it seriously. You do listen before you make any judgments. And let's say somebody has a really good idea, a shortcut or something. Put it up. You know, one of the things you can do is you can tweet tips and tricks. And if you have, say, a regular schedule, like you know, I will be tweeting the latest tip on Friday at 2 o'clock every week, right? People will go looking for it. And it becomes a thing. It's like, you know, tuning in your favorite TV program, right? So you start to attract an audience. And again, that builds loyalty. And as I said, give attribution. The other thing you can do is make a YouTube video. Create a channel, and if you've got people who are good speakers or good at presenting what they do, let the user do it. Why not? You know? That's another way of validating those people and integrating them into the community and getting them in that upper right-hand quadrant of the user learning space where they are sharing community, becoming mentors, and giving out into the community as well as getting back from it. So what we're talking about here is creating more value from the value that you capture. And the really important thing here is to remember that it's an iterative process. It's not going to necessarily produce fantastic results the first time you try it. You have to give it time. You have to let it run, learn from your mistakes, and so on. But nothing is going to buy you more customer loyalty than building their participation into your decision-making process. And that goes also for your SMEs. Some of those cards that have gotten around there talk about recalcitrant SMEs that don't want to do their reviews. Well, if you've got them contributing to the way that you do your user assistance, and they're contributing not only by saying, yes, this is correct, but by saying, you might try doing it this way because it might be better, or you could deliver it in a different way or so on. Get them actively involved. You're not going to have any problem getting them to review you anymore because they're engaged. So you want to engage people internally, externally, and that goes for everybody, from top management to the person who scrubs the floor. And I mean that. I work a lot in France. And in France, networking tends to be horizontal. That is, managers network with other managers. People on the factory floor network with each other. There isn't a whole lot of vertical networking that goes on in French culture. This is starting to change now. It's starting to change because there's a whole enormous amount of valuable intelligence that's not being collected simply because people don't go vertical. Somebody on the factory floor who's putting stuff together probably has a much better view of how we could make a process more efficient than somebody who's sitting in front of a computer screen and designing systems, right? Because they have to do it every day. And they know how much effort it takes. And if the guy in the executive office isn't listening to the guy on the shop floor who has that experience, boy, are they wasting extremely valuable experience. Well, all of us, we are the connective tissue. We're the people that get that global view. There's hardly anybody in the enterprise today that has a global view of stuff. There's maybe us and the test department. And that's about it. So we've got something that nobody else has. It's part of our added value to the products, which is that global, horizontal, slightly removed sort of 19th century naturalist's view that is far enough away that we can see the whole and close enough that we can still see detail. Hardly anybody has that anymore. We're all too specialized. So this is something that we've got to contribute. And that's the thought I'm going to leave you with on this. And just before we stop, and we have time if people have any questions or comments, but I'm just going to do my little bit of publicity, self-promotion here, especially for the Transformation Society, which is a new venture that I'm starting, in the process of starting, which is a research and training operation in which we're talking about these sorts of things. We have a webinar series that we're doing with Adobe. Max is the impresario of that particular operation. And we're working with some other people. Chris and I are talking about some collaborations that we might do. So we're starting to develop some public presence in which we're dealing with some of these issues. And it's very, very exciting. And I've been a consultant and practitioner in this business for a long time. This is all very nice stuff. These are some of the things that we're doing in the Transformation Society. And if you want to continue the conversation, all you have to do is pass me your business card and we'll continue to talk about it. So that's for that. If you've got any questions, thoughts, comments, criticisms, we've got about 15 minutes in which we can explore those. Yeah, Max.
Yeah, I agree with all of your priorities at the end in terms of building community, getting people involved, et cetera. So I'm going to throw out kind of a challenge that I think has happened to others as well. The particular product that I work with has a couple of forums that have been around for a long time. And two of them, I would say, have really become polluted by just becoming toxic. And there's about 15 people who are not employed full-time, who are contractors, who are just bitter that the world is never going to go back to 2007. They have a lot of free time on their hands. And everything that is posted is not whether it's about my company or my product, just everything is negative and horrible. And so what's happening is people are, the useful people who have intelligent feedback are leaving the world. It's just turning into like a noise investment.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what I would say is in some cases, if something is sort of a semi-company sanctioned space that becomes like that, what do you recommend to do in terms of replacing it or somehow overcoming this social networking aspect of just the worst thing that you possibly think of being the first thing on your fingers and then a whole bunch of Me Too, yes, God, that's awful, I had the same thing happen. These sort of flaming circular discussions.
Okay.
It's like swimming full of mud.
First question, is there a moderator of some sort?
No.
That's the first problem.
And by definition,
All I heard was blah, blah, blah.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So what Max is saying is that in his company they have a number of forums, and where in some of them, basically all the conversation has become dominated by essentially flamers who are very negative in terms of everything they say, and then what it's doing is chasing away a lot of the intelligent participants and so on. And so
and to add to this, this is not a company-owned or service-sponsored forum. It's something that started as a Usenet group on Unix. It's been around for 20 years, so it's basically like a public meeting space that we don't have control over.
okay.
But it has our product name on it, framers.com. That's a place to go and rant about how much you can't stand Adobe.
Well,
That's what it's turned into.
okay, I think, first of all, you want it to be something that you create,
Yeah.
right? Not necessarily because you control it, but because you guide it, which is a different thing. And the other thing is that these user forums that don't have a moderator, this is not what I'm talking about at all. What I'm talking about is the kind of thing that we used to have back in the 80s when online communication was relatively a walled garden inside places like CompuServe, The Source, America Online, etc., and where, in fact, forums were moderated. Now, I say in some other presentations, I don't like the word moderator because moderator implies damping down. And in Romance languages like French, Spanish, Italian, and so on, the equivalent word is animator. And I much prefer that because the point is that when you have that role, your job is to animate the discussion, to stimulate discussion, to raise subjects that you then hope other people are going to respond to. It is also, though, your job to moderate in the sense that when there are flamers, you have to control them. The best way to handle flamers when you are an official animator is a back-channel communication where you go and you send that person a private note that says, people are complaining about the tone or about the aggressivity of your comments. Could you please tone it down? There might be a particularly offensive post in which you would ask the person to please remove it. I would say in 7 out of 10 cases, that's what happens. The other cases are a lot more difficult to handle. In some cases, the moderator has to simply remove it, remove the post, and the moderator should have that power, or the animator, in terms of the way the software is configured. And in the most extreme cases, the person gets banned. Right? Now, those last two are extremely difficult things to do because even in a situation in which everybody agrees this person was out of line, this person needed to be cut, or at least the comment needed to be deleted, as soon as you do anything that looks and feels like censorship, it's a bucket of cold water on the discussion. So you really don't want to do that if you don't have to. But sometimes you do have to. And it's not, I mean, although you want free and open discussion, we're not talking about a town forum here. We're talking about a product-oriented, directed community. And the idea is to form community. And the answer to, the censorship question is, it's not a question of censorship, it's a question of whether this person is participating in the community. There are ways to criticize inside the community as a participant, and there are ways to simply crush the community. And what you don't want is you don't want somebody who's performing the function of the crusher. You want criticism, you want open discussion, but inside the community as a constructive participant. And that's the way that you deal with that. It is a skill. Doing this is a skill. And it does require time and effort. Just opening a forum and saying, this is the forum for discussing this, no. We've already got enough of those, and we've already seen the results. And forgive me, Max, but you go to the Adobe forums from the Adobe Air Help, and sorry, you don't get what you're looking for.
No, I agree totally.
It's, this is not what we're talking about here. When I talk about these integrated communities, that's what I really mean. I mean real integration, and that means people from the company, not just the moderator, but other people from the company participate as equal participants. They're not there to pontificate on what we are doing. They're there to learn and to contribute as participants. If somebody says, well, we are doing this, so screw you, then they're not good participants. And the animator has to go to those people and say, look, that's not what we're here for. I mean, you may think that, and in the end, you may actually do that, but that's not what you're saying online. Online, you have to be, right? And eventually, what happens is, Kurt Vonnegut said in a preface to one of his novels, he said, "You are what you pretend to be, so you must be very careful what you pretend to be." And this pretending is, eventually you do become that. So when you have people who say have that attitude, we know better, get them to play act, and eventually they will actually change their attitude.
Yeah.
Sorry, no.
No, I was just going to comment on, I used to work for Dell Computers, and we had the exact same problem. Right? It was a third-party website. We didn't have any control over it, and the site was actually called Dell. Right? So what we did is what we found out is that, some people just want to gripe. There's really nothing you can do about that. But we went in and we posted. We said, hey, look, we understand you might just want to complain, but if you really have a grievance that you want us to do something about, here's where you go. And then we would direct you to the right place. And then that really helped
Yeah,
a lot.
yeah.
Because, people saw that we were active, we did want to engage, we did want to solve problems, and that kind of took care of it.
If I can share what I have what you just said, Ray, you made me think of a very positive example. Not Adobe, someone else that I'd like to share. If anybody would like to look up a really good website where somebody's done exactly what Ray is talking about, there's a product called Scott E Vest, SCOTT, E as in electronic, VEST. Basically what it is it's clothing for travelers with a lot of hidden zippered pockets. You can take off the vest or jacket and have everything go through airport security. And what they did that's very interesting is they created a forum for people who thought of new uses and made suggestions. And their biggest fan is a guy called Jorge in Canada. And Jorge wanted to have a pocket where he could zip here and hide things. And they actually created a YouTube video of Jorge demonstrating what he suggested that was added to the product, and it's on their homepage page. It's a brilliant website. And by the way, I highly recommend their product. If you travel, it's like Mary Poppins' bag. You just keep pulling stuff out of your shirt.
Everybody get that? Yeah. So there you go. It's a perfect example. When I said, do videos of somebody, one of your users showing their tip or trick, that's exactly what they've done. Is they got the guy that made the suggestion, they took his suggestion, and then they got him to demonstrate it on their website. That's perfect. That Jorge is now a customer for life. There's and other people seeing that Jorge could do that, they also become more loyal because they say any company that will listen to me or someone like me, at that level deserves my custom. And that there's just no better way to build loyalty, absolutely. And you do it, of course, one person at a time. But it really works. And I can't say enough about that. And that's this whole thing about connectivism and the whole thing about, cognitively, we get satisfaction from this process, this learning process. The learning process is more important than what we know. In another situation, I do talk about the fact that despite the fact that that's true, somehow we do need some sort of fund of general culture that we need to have stuffed into our heads in order to be able to make use of that process. And the interesting question for educators at the primary and secondary level is, what is the appropriate level? How much information and of what kind? And that, of course, is an extremely difficult and complex subject that educators are cracking their heads against the wall about at the moment. But the fact is that as we put things together, we get a lot more. We get a lot more out of it, and then we get the whole is other than the sum of its parts. Yes.
Trade magazine, because we were the expert you're in a position of listening. And as you say, listening is very expensive. And you want to listen hard and then do something good with it. The only place I see a useful way where you could, in a software development context, where you can get user, because where you started off was about user assistance, is an open source content management system where they have a thing called Block, where stakeholders, customers as well as the developers, could come up with an idea for developing something, a feature from the content management system, and people would vote on it. And those who are the biggest, the ones that were like the best, were probably the ones that would go further forward, so that the whole product would develop that way. And the people who got the most, I don't know, votes became more influenced, so they had higher weighting. So whether you were an internal developer or a client, you really bought in because you worked on something you bothered about, you were really buying into it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I haven't been on any community, so-called community, where I'm not bothered, really, to want to help them build it. I mean, because you talked about products, consumer products, you talked about software developing, some Linux and all the other things. So, I mean, I think this illustrates the complexity of it all. There isn't, I can't see how the message about having a user community is a panacea for everything. It's very, sort of very, very specific. Going back to what you said about learning and collaborating. But if you can find a context where that is the key thing, then you might have half a chance. But I can't see how the social general, what we understand, our paradigm of social media communities can really help, you know.
Okay, yeah, I'm getting what you're saying. Correct me if I'm wrong in summarizing this. Basically, if I hear you right, you're saying that you don't see the social media as a panacea for fixing everything, and that sometimes if you ask users what they want, they don't actually know so much even what they need necessarily, right? And so you need other ways. I think you're right. First of all, I don't think these things are panaceas. I don't think you can solve everything. I don't think that by having an integrated community like this, that you no longer have the need for a product manager or a roadmap or any of the other things that you do to develop a product. It's also really important to remember what Jacob Nielsen says about user testing, which is don't ask users what they do or what they want. Watch what they actually do and learn from that. That's a much better guide for developing products and for understanding usability than asking people. You ask people, do you want this? Of course they're going to say yes. That doesn't mean they're going to use it, right? And look at how many products have hundreds and hundreds of features, most of which most of us don't use. The question that a lot of the developers of these products need to ask is, are there features that we are spending money and time on maintaining and upgrading which are used by almost nobody, and that maybe we could take out of our product? Because we are always adding new features, a lot of the time, in order to satisfy customer requests. And at the same time, we don't have, and this applies to user assistance as well, we don't have a very good governance structure for controlling obsolescence. We're really good at adding new stuff. We're not very good at taking out dead stuff. Look at how many web pages are never visited. Look at how many features are not used. Look at information that nobody looks at and that may be years out of date, but nobody's taken down because nobody's even gone there. But at the same time, keeping these sites up and so on, keeping these pages active, is actually using storage that we pay for. It's using capacity, and it is actually costing something. So what we need is good governance. And good governance means, among other things, obsolescence control.
You've got one of these problems because they haven't kept proper statistics. It's more to do with testing, because we're putting out a test procedure, and it's becoming obvious that there's a lot of tests in it that nobody ever fails, because it's more or less impossible now to fail it. Maybe once you could, and so
Yeah.
we're making people do things and spend time that is just not reasonable. So I think in that case the thing is to collect more statistics and find out what's really going wrong.
Well, we're just about out of time. I will just pass one last anecdote, which is about connectivism. James Lovelock, the British scientist who discovered the hole in the ozone and invented the famous Gaia theory that many people know about, he told a story. He said, if you look at the proportion of gases in the atmosphere, he said, it is not natural. If you bottle up just air from the atmosphere and hermetically, the gases will naturally recombine in a different way, and there will be a lot less oxygen. So the quantity of oxygen in the atmosphere is artificially maintained. And the question is, how? Well, obviously, we all know about photosynthesis, green plants, and so on. But if you actually do the calculation, if you make an estimate of all the photosynthesizers on the surface of the planet and the amount of oxygen in the air, it doesn't jive. There's more oxygen in the air than they can make. So atmospheric scientists have been working on this for years and years and years. Then Lovelock discovered that entomologists were studying a beetle. And one of the things that this beetle does is it farts oxygen. Well, if you calculate all the little oxygen expulsions of these beetles, and you add it to the production of the photosynthesizers, you just about make up the difference. And he said, in writing this up, he said, I didn't discover anything. There were lots of people working on the beetles, and there were lots of people working on the oxygen in the air. They just didn't know about each other. And all he did was put them together. That's connectivism. And that's a lot of what we do inside our companies and with our users. And that's, I think, one of the most glorious things that we could possibly do. And that's the thought I'll leave you with. So thanks very much.